Welcome to Skin Sync, the official podcast of Elevate-Derm Alliance, your trusted source for the latest in dermatology for PAs and NPs. Join our hosts for real clinician perspectives and expert guest insights as they explore everyday dermatology topics with practical takeaways.
So, Bucci, have you ever heard of the brands Axone, Clobex spray, ketoconazole generic shampoo? Let's think. Rogaine, or Zoryve. Are these products that you have ever written before or have prescribed multiple times in your career?
Probably hundreds of prescriptions over the years. I'm pretty familiar with some of them. Why do you ask, Shanna?
So, the reason I ask is because I am so excited to announce that tonight we get to actually interview someone who had a hand in either the formulation or the creation or bringing to market of all of these products, Dr. David Osborne. Dr. Osborne, welcome to the Skin Sync podcast. Should I call you Dr. Osborne or would you prefer me to call you David?
I'll just please call me David. Don't, I'm not a real doctor, as my mom liked me when I graduated with my PhD. So,
Well, you have certainly helped millions and millions of patients with all of the medications that you have had a hand in helping bring to market. So, David, we are so very, very grateful for your time today. Thank you so much for joining us on the Skin Sync podcast.
I wanted to briefly go over your bio. You have a really wonderful resume. But Dr. Osborne, or David, received his bachelor's degree in chemistry from the Missouri State University in 1982, PhD in physical chemistry from Missouri University of Science and Technology in 1985, where he studied human stratum corneum using small angle X-ray diffraction. He started his career as a research scientist with Upjohn Company, which is now Pfizer. And more recently, he was actually the co-founder, chief technical officer, and essentially employee number one of Arcutis Biotherapeutics. And in 2025, was named the chief scientific officer of Stratum Biosciences and chief innovative officer of Pavella Therapeutics. Dr. Osborne has issued over 54 U.S. patents, has over 65 publications, and he is the developer of over 40 topical products, many of which we're all familiar with. And Shanna, you just named several of them. So Dr. Osborne, or excuse me, David, again, welcome to the podcast. So glad to have you here. So let's get started. I wanted to ask you about your path from completing your PhD to now becoming one of dermatology's most respected scientists and formulators. How did you get to this path?
yeah, it was unique. My graduate program was unique in that I selected my PhD advisor prior to enrolling in grad school. I was undergraduate. Last year, as an undergraduate chemistry major uh, at Missouri State University, I was a co-op student. I've been married a couple of years, had to make some money, so I was working 20 hours a week as a uh, QC chemist at a wood preservative company. And they had, it's named Simonson Chemical Company, and they had uh, commissioned a piece of research for a microemulsion formulation of perchlorophenol, which is I think it's a wood preservative that has now been banned by the EPA, but it was in common use back in the early 80s. And so Stick Freeberg had made this microemulsion, and one of my tasks when I wasn't looking at boiling points or doing chlorine titrations uh, was to treat wood with this microemulsion and see how well microemulsion actually delivered the wood preservative chemical into wood. And I was really impressed by this research, and I was really impressed by this curator's distinguished professor, Stig Freeberg at the University of Missouri-Rolla. So later that year, when I got a call from Rolla, because someone had initially accepted a full ride scholarship for PhD program at the University of Missouri-Rolla, but they ended up taking another scholarship. And so they offered this chancellor's fellowship to me because of my grades and test scores. And I was like, oh, I know a guy up there, Stig Freeberg. And my wife and I drove up to Raleigh, a couple hours from my hometown, and we were so impressed that I took the fellowship. And what's unique about Stig is a few years before, in the 70s, he had actually published some uh, pivotal science explaining why cosmetic emulsions would be much more physically stable with just a small addition of emulsifier. So he had won all sorts of international cosmetic chemistry awards. And so right after I came on board, there was a Westvaco fellowship, research fellowship available, and I was a student selected. And Stig went out to UCSF and met with Peter Elias. And the rest of my life was kind of charted from that encounter because I was studying epidermal lipids, lipids of stratum corneum, and how skin softeners interacted with those lipids.
And the entire dermatology community has benefited for the last 40 years because of those decisions. So we are so incredibly grateful for that, those decisions that you made all those years ago. You've been the chief technical officer at Arcutis, as Bucci mentioned, since 2017, and you were the mastermind behind the development of both roflumilast cream and foam. Tell us a little bit about, I know you could probably do an entire, hour on roflumilast, even more than that. You could tell us so much about, the nuances of it. But what's unique about this vehicle in the products, specifically using transcutol instead of propylene glycol? And what were some of the challenges that you faced when created these formulations?
Yeah, so Zoryve is a really unique formulation in that the vehicle itself does not uh, compromise the skin barrier at all, right? It doesn't fluidize the epidermal lipids. None of the ingredients are able to extract lipids from the skin or hair, and that we intentionally formulated a very mild formulation, right? Because the patient I was envisioning when I first started formulating Zoryve was like a 3-month-old with severe atopic dermatitis on their face, right? And you can do no harm for that patient, right? So you have to have a very mild formulation, very mild vehicle, and so that was the starting point. Unfortunately, usually if you have water, you need an emulsifier. If you want a moisturizing formulation, which you need for atopic dermatitis patients, you need a nice moisturizing cream. And so we were just very fortunate that we selected a novel emulsifier, Crodofas CES, which cannot extract lipids from the skin.
And what were
So
some of the challenges with formulating that product? I know it wasn't as simple as some of your other formulations, but what were the challenges you faced?
yeah, the main problem with roflumilast is it hates water, right? It's water. Its solubility in water is actually less than the solubility of kerosene in water. Right.
Wow.
So
That's
you know, I
significant.
I grew up, uh, Missouri in the Ozarks, and our family is always, we were at the lake and water skiing, and we'd have these outboard motors, and you'd always see that rainbow sheen of oil. Sort of the, roflumilast was less soluble than that. Okay, so there's, no. Now, as a formulator, we deal with insoluble compounds, actives all the time. But the tricky thing about roflumilast is it really likes to supersaturate. So you'll blend it in a little bit of water, a little bit of transcutol in your solvent system. Everything goes into solution. And then it all falls out like a month later, right? And that's a very annoying tendency for a drug to have when you're trying to formulate it because drug that precipitates out will not cross the skin,
Right.
right? And you probably remember my first experience was back in the Rogaine days. Uh, the formulation would run off of the scalp. Um, Patients didn't like that, but the ethanol would flash off, the drug would precipitate, it would leave a white residue on the skin, and that drug is not available to work. And so precipitated drug never permeates and never um, treats the condition. And so it's really unfortunate if you have a drug that pretends to be dissolved and then a month later precipitates out. And so any clinical testing that you did on that product while it was dissolved, you get great results. And then it doesn't work at all. Right. So that was the biggest challenge with roflumilast. But fortunately, with Transcutol and with the Crodofas, we were able to find a combination of ingredients that were safe and also kept the drug in solution and gave very consistent delivery of the skin.
That's fantastic. I think, specifically, all medical providers are not given enough education on drug development, on what goes into the medications that we prescribe. In fact, so little of that of our precious pharmacology, time spent in school was on vehicle and how important those vehicles can be. So, what is something that you wish dermatology providers understood more about vehicles, since you've dedicated your entire career to drug development? Is it all about the patient preference or feel, or are certain vehicles really more effectively absorbed into the skin? Like, can actually certain vehicles increase penetration of the active ingredient on their own, or do penetration enhancers need to be, provided for, a lot of different vehicles?
Definitely, we have, number of molecules available to us, excipients available to us that enhance delivery, right? Propylene glycols, very famous one. Oleo alcohol and oleic acid are good skin penetration enhancers. Um, and the combination of propylene glycol and oleo alcohol, you get synergistic enhancement. So one thing I think everyone that I would like all providers to understand when it comes to these skin penetration enhancers is that they modify the skin's barrier, they reduce the skin's barrier over a certain time course. That's very dependent upon the structure of that excipient. So propylene glycol, it probably only impacts the barrier 20 minutes or less, right? After 10, 15 minutes, it will have totally passed through the stratum corneum. It will become systemic. Propylene glycol, these amounts aren't that much, so they're safe. Or some of it will actually evaporate and be volatile. Now, if you think about, and we go back to old Rogaine formulation, propylene glycol, ethanol, and water, right? The ethanol flashes off really fast, but some of it goes through the stratum corneum. It's also an enhancer, and therefore, the skin returns to its normal barrier properties, within an hour, probably within 20 minutes, maybe even less. But oleo alcohol, it's going to remain in the stratum corneum for 2 or 3 days. It is not sufficiently water soluble. Its partition coefficient, the octanol water partition coefficient is like 8. So it's, what is that? 100 million times more soluble in oil than it is in water. So it's not penetrating through. It's just going to remain in the stratum corneum until it's desquamated. Okay. So, and I think this pertains to, formulation stacking, because was that a short-term enhancer or a long-term enhancer? And so uh, each enhancer, its effect lingers a different length of time. And so you need to be aware of that. Uh, the other thing is, uh, I can't emphasize solubility too much because probably well, I don't know. You're both so young that you may have not been trained this way, but used to, based on corticosteroids, everyone was told ointments are the best delivery
Right.
Yep,
vehicle,
I was trained that
right?
way for sure. Mhm.
Yeah, creams are not as good of a delivery vehicle. Well, that was all based on the uh, corticosteroid, topical corticosteroids, back in the 70s and 80s. Um, these drugs were just more soluble in the ointments, right?
So it wasn't that the drug worked better, it just stayed soluble longer in an ointment rather than a cream, rather than a gel.
It was dissolved, so you were essentially dosing with a higher dose of corticosteroid. Now, what changed all that was when Boyd Paulson at Simtex started adding propylene glycol, right? And that's when we were getting augmented formulations, right? Because you had propylene glycol. That's when uh, you know, betamethasone cream with propylene glycol, the augmented form, was a class one steroid, whereas the cream without propylene glycol, well, that's just because all the drug was dissolved. And it's really hard to tell whether a you know, less than 1% drug is dissolved in a cream because it's white and you've got emulsion and you can usually have a lot of biorefringence depending on the emulsifier used. So to look under the microscope and actually pick out the drug crystals, very hard, almost impossible, right? And once I started using propylene glycol, all the drug was dissolved and delivery was much more consistent from those corticosteroid products. So it's important that, multi-factors, right, as to how these vehicles deliver. It's always tailored and customized to a specific drug. But some of those rules of thumb that have been trained throughout generations of providers uh, are not, the reason uh, is really more fundamental and has to do usually with solubility or how the formulation rubs in.
Excellent.
Right.
So, and as we kind of lead to that point, skincare, the conversation about skincare in general is really having a big moment in the last several years, especially with our teenagers, our acne population. So, couple questions there. Number one is when we're using multiple products, some people have a 9-step routine, and we're layering all these topical agents. How do we really know that, one agent's penetrating the skin over the other? And, for example, the sandwich method, I'm sure you've heard of this before, where you put on a topical moisturizer, then your tretinoin or retinoid product, and then another moisturizer over that. So I do have a question about, penetration. And then the other question is, are there potential interactions? I had heard in the past that topical dapsone and benzoyl peroxide don't really mix well together. So can you just kind of, give some details about that?
Yeah. So, well, let me answer the first question first, and then the BPO dapsone. I can give you, a nice story of my experience with those products. Okay, back when we were developing dapsone in the first place. So, if I was going to try to explain to a patient, and especially like a teenage boy, okay, I know the difference between how my son treated his acne. Now he's almost 40 now, but how he treated his acne compared to my daughter, how she treated her acne. You know, her face looked great, his face looked terrible. And which, we were right in the midst of developing Dapsone for the treatment of acne at that time. And it was sort of like, at least dent the tube between visits to the dermatologist.
You had your own test subjects right at home. You could practice on them.
I will never admit to having done that. So
We won't tell the FDA, it's fine.
but the, uh, so when do you layer these products? Okay, you know, we're in the midst of football season, right? So let's give a football analogy. I never played football. I don't actually watch football, uh, but you know, I think I can give you sort of an idea that you can tell the patient. So, think about the football itself as a drug, and for it to reach the effective place to treat the acne, that's the end zone. All right. So you're moving down the field. As a formulator, I'm the coach. The defensive team is the stratum corneum. It's the barrier to delivery. Right. I know because I've handpicked this formulation that I will score. I will get the football into the end zone every time because I know the stratum corneum. I know the defense. I know how to overcome their strategies and tactics. So when I formulate a product, I know the drug is going to make it into the end zone every play. Now, sometimes it'll take 7 plays. Sometimes it may take 12 plays. But I am convinced every time that my formulation it will deliver a result of a touchdown. Okay. Now, introduce another coach, another product. He is also extremely confident that he's going to deliver that product, tretinoid, to the end zone. Okay. But when you apply these together, it's like having 4 teams on the football field at the same time, right? Now, sometimes it's probably going to work a little better. Sometimes it's going to work a whole lot worse. But the chaos that produces means you are no longer guaranteed a result, either good tolerability or good efficacy. Anything can happen.
That's a
Okay.
great
I
analogy.
love I
Yeah,
love the
that was
football
fantastic.
analogy. I am married to a man who was a football coach for 25 years. My son played high school football, so I am completely picking up what you're putting down here. And I also can even kind of within that analogy see how other things can be a second defensive line preventing you from getting to that end zone. You might have 5 different defensive lines, not just the stratum corneum, but the serum they put on, the moisturizing cream they put on before they applied their topical prescription, the whatever they rubbed on as a, leave-on, emollient remover for makeup. Unfortunately, skincare has gotten so savvy, and influencers are telling our patients that they need to use 40 different products, not that many, but way too many products. And I really try to simplify things. So I love the idea of one defensive line instead of 5 different defensive lines with multiple quarterbacks trying to get into that end zone. So that
And Shannon,
analogy
I don't
for
watch
sure speaks to
football.
me.
I don't watch football at all, and nor do I understand football, but that analogy stuck with me, so I'm gonna remember that. So I appreciate that. Thank you, David.
So the follow on to that is how do you tease out, right, the chaos? Well, the longer you have between multiple products, multiple teams being on the field at the same time, the better the outcome. So if you can wait 10 minutes between applications, if you can wait 20 minutes, of course, if you're just talking about, you know, once a day treatment in the morning and a once a day treatment at night, right? That's ideal because they're not going to be active on the field at the same time. You're not going to get that same level of chaos. Uh, but if you are putting 5 products, that's like having 5 games going on the same field at the same time. And
So just
who knows
just to clear
what
it up from the coach's mouth, coach, do you prefer that your product as a developer goes on first and then moisturizer on top?
who knows? Who knows? Right?
Oh, that's an interesting answer.
Yeah, it's just chaos. So I can't predict that, right? I can't predict that. Yes, if my product goes on first, it's going to provide a more reliable outcome. But if you put a moisturizer on immediately after or immediately before, I have no idea whether I make it to the end zone or not. I have
That's
no idea.
very interesting. So, Bucci led to this earlier. You led the development of Axone Gel, which was an incredibly popular product in dermatology. What is the process for new drug development? Like, how did that come to pass? Where did your idea stem from? And I definitely want to hear your take on the Dapsone BPO. I want to hear that story as well, because I know
So
what it did on my fair skin.
I'll tell you the Dapsone BPO story first because
Okay.
it really ties into this, stacking formulations. So, I've been formulating a long time, right? I've been married longer than I've been formulating, but I've been, formulating for over 40 years. And so, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is, oh, I should put, you know, BPO as a gel. We developed a lot of BPO generics, and I developed a Cania back in the day with Gord. So that BPO in the lab. So I make the Dapsone gel, and they're both carpopol gels, and so I add in the BPO, and it looks great. That mixes up, it gels just fine. And then I watch this white BPO suspension kind of turn mocha color, and then, it gets browner and browner, and it's like, hot chocolate 20 minutes later, right? I've never seen discoloration that fast. This is like doing a titration, and watching it, go from colorless to pink or something. And I was just like, this will never work. Now, BPO is a potent oxidizer, and it's degrading. It doesn't really degrade dapsone that much, right? Because if you do the assays, you can have them together for like days, and you only see about a 2% drop in dapsone potency. Not, I'm not talking about 5% down to 3%. I'm talking about 5% going down to, 4.8% or something like that. Okay. So, but that degradation product is so highly colored. It's just like this, dark, dark brown color. And so you see it really fast, and it comes off. It looks like it's staining the skin. I don't know that it actually stains the skin, but it is very noticeable. So
Oh,
you
yeah.
can't have those two together. They
I
don't
will
play.
tell you, I had multiple patients complain, about the staining, and it wasn't permanent, but it was like a really bad fake tan. And it did stay for a
Yeah,
couple of day, it would eventually wash off, but I would just make a joke and say, "Enjoy the orange glow and please apply your BPO at an opposite time of the day."
yeah. No, you cannot stack those products, and it would, you know, be a great tutorial just to mix it up and show people how quickly it changes color.
Yeah,
Yes.
for sure.
So, question for you. You over the last several years, there's kind of been a bit of a shift as far as patients and what they desire from their topical agents and products. What are the things that you've really noticed that have been the most prominent? There's a lot of conversation about the skin barrier, the microbiome, and of course the whole clean, movement using clean products that are preservative free. So, what are some of the shifts that you've noticed over the last, 40 years of doing this?
Yeah, well, the shift to preservative free, I think is really good. I I don't know that, the parabens, especially the parabens, are all that. But what I do know is that as formulators, we always over preserve, and we never look back. We never check if that preservative level is necessary. And the reason is, the USP preservative efficacy test, you have to do that. You have to pass that test at time zero, but also at the end of your shelf life, right? And now, once you validate that the remaining preservative is sufficient at the end of the shelf life, which is, usually 2 years, but it can be longer, it can be 3 years, that you still pass the test, you can then go back and chemically assay the parabens and say, yes, I don't have to do the preservative efficacy, this micro test anymore. I can just do the chemical assay of the parabens. Um, but you run the risk of not being under-preserved, right, at that T0 point. So when you're developing the product and you're in the clinic, um, everyone over-preserves because the risk of under-preserving and having to change your formulation after you generate the clinical data, that's career ending for the formulator. They'll lose their job, right? And so nobody does it. So the fact that everyone over preserves, okay, that's understandable. But what's not understandable is why people don't, after that 2 years, check lower concentrations of preservatives to see how much you actually need and to plan for that so that you put up enough stability so that uh, at lower concentrations of preservatives so that you can test that with the USP test after 2 years at your conditions, right? And then post market, drop the amount of preservative in your product. Make it a minimal amount that's fully effective, which is all you really need. And so that you're not overexposing every patient to the parabens, to phenoxyethanol and the other preservatives. And that's only good practice, but nobody does it, right? And I I I I don't know about Zarif, but I think they're going to be, Arcutis is going to be the first company to really take a hard look at how much preservative is truly necessary, and then change the product so that you minimize the amount of preservative being patients are exposed to, and
That's
that's the right way to formulate, right?
That's
So.
phenomenal, and you bring up so many good points that I wanna really dive into, and we are running out of the precious time we have with you, but so I wanna ask you a couple questions. Can we Speaking of, end of shelf life, can we ask you frankly about expiration dates? Like, what are the risks of using a topical prescription product beyond expiration? My patients will come in and asking all the time. I practice in Southwest Florida, and they ask, like, "Does my sunscreen really expire? Like, can I use it beyond?" And so what is the concern? What is the risk there? Does it just become less effective? Or are they truly at risk of chemical burns or exposures when things fall out of solution?
Right. Typical spec for any active in OTC products and prescription products, it's 90 to 110% of label, right? So if I have 1% drug or 1% sunscreen or 1%, active, uh, at the end of the shelf life, I have to be above 29%. Okay. Now, you don't necessarily hit this 1% when you manufacture, right? Usually, you're 0.99%, 0.98%, or you're, 1.01, 1.02. You're close, but the assays have a little wobble in them. And, it's just, you know, gain variances and how accurate the scales are and all of these factors, right? So usually to build in a safety margin, you don't want more than 5% degradation, right? So you're holding yourself to the higher standard, right? So uh, you're not going to, you know, market a product that goes below 0.95% because maybe you started out at 0.98, now you lose that 5% and you're 0.93, and that's a little too close because if when you assay that product, that one lot of product a year that you're required to put on full ICH stability, if you dip below zero point 0.9, and that means 0.895, then you have to notify the local branch of the FDA that your product is out of spec. Okay.
Oh.
So nobody does that, right? That is the last thing you want to ever, your VP of quality does not want to make that call. Now, having had to make that call a few times, not too many times in my career, you just tell them, well, we've already sold through all this product and, there's no expired product on the market. Um, so we don't have to do a recall because none of it's out there and you can usually talk your way out of it. But, companies just won't do that. So usually you're going to have some room. So it's not like it's falling off a cliff, right? These are gradual degradations, you know. So people, no one can tell you to use a product after its shelf life, but it's not as if it's going to harm or do damage
Mhm.
necessarily, especially if we're talking a month or two. But that's all predicated on it being stored correctly,
Not in the
right?
hot car
Right,
in the middle of summer, right?
Yeah.
right.
And so you might not get the 2 years if it's not controlled room temperature. So, how well are you treating your product, right? So,
And where
um,
do people practice and where are patients storing, their product? I think a lot of us learned a lot, during the benzene debacle of 2024 when all of a sudden we started saying, "Oh my gosh, do we have to recall all of these BPO products? Should we be prescribing benzoyl peroxide inclusive products that are not cold chain shipped to the patient?" Because we don't know what Amazon warehouse they sat in, what hot Amazon car they were delivered to the patient in, and especially in the South, we there's not, there are days that get above that 114 degrees in a hot car for sure. So I think, formulations can certainly, change dramatically with changes in shifts in temperature and humidity and providers have to be aware of that when we're prescribing their products to adequately counsel our patients how to store and care for their product and also how to properly, kind of take care of it when it's in their home.
yeah. I think you should look at the shelf life as even with a few high temperature excursions, even with the expected level of abuse that most people give products, if it's within its labeled shelf life, it's still going to be good, right? That's really the commitment, right, of the manufacturer to you as the provider and the commitment of uh, the manufacturer to the patient. Once you exceed that shelf life, it's just no longer a guarantee.
That's very helpful. So,
Yeah.
this may be a loaded question, so you don't have to elaborate if it's going to be challenging. But essentially, right now we're practicing in an era where cost and access to medications are just difficult. It's an everyday issue with almost every patient that we see, right? And I think a lot of clinicians are inclined to just switch to a generic very quickly or perhaps use a compounding pharmacy where, we're hoping to get the same medication, perhaps for a cash price of $45. So, what are your thoughts on, choosing that brand name product, fighting for it, getting it covered through the insurance versus, picking the generic option because it's the easier thing to do or the quicker way to go about it?
But, if it's an FDA approved generic, then it's gone through the testing. And so, it's had a lot of scrutiny. I've developed a lot of generic products, and our generic products were bioequivalent to the brands. Okay. Now, there is a mechanism, right? Um, uh, so, there's, you should have no concern about prescribing a generic unless, sometimes the generics will have a different preservative, right? Sometimes a generic could contain propylene glycol and the innovator product not contain propylene glycol. And so if you have a patient that's allergic, but it'll be listed on the ingredient list. But there are some exceptions with allergy to formulation differences, but the drug delivery over the shelf life of the product uh, should be the same between the generic and the innovator product. So that I won't be concerned about. Compounding pharmacies, uh, So we talked about Zoryve and we talked about roflumilast. So even before the 0.3% cream was approved, there were compounding pharmacies that were taking roflumilast drug, dissolving it in a minimum amount of ethanol, uh, what worked out in the final composition to be 20% ethanol, right? And adding it to 0.3% roflumilast cream. You can dissolve roflumilast in ethanol, but as soon as you blend it with CeraVe, it's all going to drop out of solution. I know that, right? And I can see those big chunky particles under the microscope, right? And so those patients spending $60 to get Zoryve uh, would be better off if they just use CeraVe in the first place because they're not getting any drug delivered to
Because
their lesion.
because essentially those patients are now slathering CeraVe with particleized roflumilast sitting on top of the skin that never actually penetrated. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. So
Yeah.
it's just going to be lost to the environment. So it's just, you know, like adding, a gritting agent to your CeraVe is going to have no effect. Now, for me as a formulator of Zoryve, when I go and talk to a provider and they say, "Oh, yeah, Zoryve doesn't work," I gave it to a patient, it doesn't work at all, and then come to find out, well, I didn't write them Zoryve because the patient didn't have access. I just had roflumilast from a compounding pharmacy, and Zoryve doesn't work. So that's highly annoying.
Of course.
So the compounding now I'm a big believer in compounding pharmacies, but not for these products. It's on the company to make sure that you have access for your patients, right? And I think Arcutis, I'm retired from Arcutis now, so I don't need to flatter anyone, but the Arcutis Cares program, so that if the patient is less than 3 times the poverty level, they will get product for free. You got to fill out some paperwork, but there's no reason that any of your patients should be denied access to Zoryve. Now, PBMs and getting into the Medicare formularies, that it's such a struggle. It's such a hassle. It was Frank Watanabe, the CEO of Arcutis. It was his goal from before we were, and they worked unfailing at gaining access for the product. And it's, it's a company that I'm proud that I was a part of. But it's hard. Um, Generics, not a moment of hesitation. Uh, Compounding pharmacies, especially for brand new products that a lot of effort went into their development, I would be cautious. I would not use them. Now, if you're talking about you've used a compounding pharmacy to combine Clovex with CeraVe for 10 years because you find that blend uh, just works really well for certain patients with certain inflammatory skin conditions. You brand your own clinical trial, right? You know that it's working for your patients. Yeah, you don't hesitate to do that. That's what compounding pharmacies are there for. These are, professionals and they're good, but um, yeah, just beware.
I think
Great
that
answer.
is such sage advice. And for those of us who do utilize compounding pharmacies, I think we all find a niche for it, right? Whether it's a 5-fluorouracil compound that works so well, and we've seen the efficacy. But I think a lot of us are a bit timid to use them for maybe some of the BPO formulations where we know BPO does not play well with others, and we know that certain chemical formulas can be very, very tricky and very, very difficult to get into the skin. So I think it's wise advice to proceed with caution. Well, Dr. Osborne, or should I say Coach Osborne, after 40 plus years of drug formulation, after getting 50 plus patents across that finish line, across that goal line, What do you consider your greatest contribution to science and medicine?
When we obtained Axone approval in 2005, we added Transcutol to the FDA's inactive ingredient database, right? And so, from 2005 on, anyone could formulate with up to 25% Transcutol in their topical products and not have to do CARC studies on Transcutol, which we did, and those sorts of things. So it opened up a very useful, very inert solvent to, derm formulators as a whole. Uh, with Zoryve, we added Crodofas CES to the IID list. Those two um, additions, which can now be used by other formulators to do superior products, that is, I feel my biggest contribution. Products come and products go. Hopefully Zoryve will, outlive me. Uh, but, it was an interesting thing. We filed the Zoryve, the first Zoryve patent, uh, happened to file it on my anniversary on June the 7th. And so I tell people, I will, when those Zoryve patents expire, I will be celebrating my 57th wedding anniversary. Okay, because it's not till 2037. And that everyone at Arcutis is invited to our house to celebrate.
I love
Oh,
that. That's
Locally,
fantastic.
Uh, but the products do, they come and go. But when you can, open up new excipients to the dermatology community as a whole, that's something that's lasting, and I think it's the biggest contribution.
It's wonderful. Well, with that said, David or Dr. Osborne, this has been a wonderful conversation, very enlightening, very insightful. And I think at least the biggest takeaway from me is kind of breaking down that formulation science and chemistry, which I try to shun a lot of the times, with real life clinical experience. I really appreciate you doing this. You are phenomenal. We're lucky to have you in the dermatology field. So thank you so much for doing this with us.
This has been pure delight, and I've enjoyed the last hour or so, and let's do it again.
Let's do it.
I love that. I love that. Thank you for all of your amazing contributions. And thank you for being a part of the Skin Sync podcast so you can bring your knowledge to the dermatology APP community. We really appreciate you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
The enduring content in this episode is sponsored by Arcutis.
Thanks for tuning in to Skin Sync. Don't forget to subscribe to Skin Sync on Spotify or Apple Podcasts so you never miss an episode. To explore more of Elevate's educational and career resources, visit elevate-derm.com. Please note, this podcast is for informational purposes only and not a substitute for professional medical advice. Always consult a licensed healthcare provider before making medical decisions. Clinicians must rely on their own judgment and training in all patient care situations.